And it's time. All righty. Good morning. How's everybody? Everybody had a good week? Pretty good week? Not so good a week? I know a lot of people's not felt well last week or two, so in general, we need to be praying for a bunch of people that are sick and not feeling good. But we'll go through our prayer list. I do want to add this morning Miss Martha Buck. We need to add her. She found out this past week that she has some melanoma that they have found, and she had sent a text out and wanted me to ask everybody to be praying. I think that they feel like they found it at early enough stages to where they can get it removed and get it treated and it not be a big deal, but I think she's a little bit worried about that. So y'all be praying for Martha. She said to continue to pray for Janet, that Janet was still moving along and getting a little better every week with a little bit of rehab. I think they're doing some motion stuff with her and her foot. So y'all continue to remember those two ladies. They're constantly going through a struggle, it seems like. So pray for Shane. Shane Isaacs, he's been sick this week and he's better now. So y'all just y'all keep praying for all these people that are going through this sickness, man. I'm telling you, it's rampant right now. Oh yeah, it's going, it's around. But I think that we're getting to a point where maybe we're starting to see it level out and maybe start coming back down a little bit now. So anybody have an update? I know that we've got several on this list. If I went through every one of them, we wouldn't get through our class. So, yes. Jack Hamilton. Jack and Lynn are members across the river over here at Grace, and real good friends of the family, mom and dad. And Jack was involved in a plane crash in Florida a couple weeks ago, and I think he had some really bad facial. I know a lot of just cosmetic bone structure, facial structures, a bunch of damage, and just not in good shape. And they were going to have to go in and do several reconstructives and some, I think a bone specialist and a plastic surgeon specialist were both kind of meeting, trying to get him scheduled to get him in and get him worked on. So he's been in critical, but I think pretty stable condition. But he's probably going to be in Florida, he and Lynn, for at least 6 or 8 weeks until they get through this. So that's going to be a really tough deal in itself, the length of time that they're going to be down there. And she's going to pretty much be there by herself without anybody that they know. So y'all pray for them, lift them up, and pray that God's hands on his surgeries and on his healing and recovery. Anybody else? Any other? Is he? Oh, wow. Okay. What? All right. Well, cool deal. How's it feel to be thinking about being a grandma? You ready? Good deal. All right. Anybody else? Any other prayer requests? I know we've got a ton of names and we've been mentioning. Y'all continue to remember Miss Eva as she's continuing to care for her daughter that she's moved in with her. I know that that's a struggle. I'm talking, she's just working full time trying to provide and trying to deal with that whole situation. She's not always able to get here and make it because it's just hard. So pray for Miss Eva. Continue to pray for the Little family, Jenna and the boys, and continue to remember them in your prayers. I was just trying to hit some. Josie Pruitt is doing better. I think she's starting to see some improvements, and hopefully we'll get to come home maybe in the next month or so, Tara? No? Josie? Okay. Oh, discharged. So that's just to be there, not to get to come home, but discharged. Okay. All right. Well, y'all continue to remember Kelly and Josie. And I don't really have any others. Anybody else have anything to add before we move forward? No? Brandon? You open us up this morning. Amen. So if you have a book and you have been following along with us, we are this week we're in lesson 15. We covered the first point last week, which is winning in your Christian, and that's winning, not whining. It says winning, so don't read that wrong. But the first point was submit to the authority of the Bible, God's Word. And there's three principles that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the other two today. But week before last, before we were out for weather, we talked about submitting to the authority of the Bible. Today, we're going to talk about support your pastor and staff financially and supplying bridges, not fences. Those are the last two principles that we're going to talk about, and we're going to try to get through those, and we're going to quit. And we'll pick up next week on lesson 16. So, last week we talked about a little bit about how some of the people there at Corinth had questioned Paul's authority and questioned, who he was and where he was from and all this. So Paul was explaining to them his situation of how God directly spoke to him and his authority through his direct contact with Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus as to what his authority on preaching the gospel was. This week, support your pastor and staff financially. Now, we get on into a little part there in 3 through 13 in chapter 9 where it's talking about some of these people were questioning Paul's authority again as a preacher or a pastor or whatever it was he was doing, because he didn't accept financial support from the churches or the people that he was preaching to. And he asked the question in verse 4, have we not power to eat and to drink? And it says here, he's kind of says this in relation to, do you not think that we have the right to be able to be supported by the people that we're serving? And then he continues on and says, have we not power to lead about a sister or a wife? And then in the last part, he writes, in the last part of that, in B part, he says, as well as other apostles and as the brethren of the Lord. So, he's talking about here, it refers in this, I'm going to turn this off or it's going to drive me crazy. Give me just a second. I won't be able to think straight. The brethren of the Lord. Who's he talking about there as the brethren? Fellow people that wrote some of the stuff, the disciples, the believers. It says here, such as the half-brothers, as James or Jude or Judas, who wrote the epistles that bear their names. Probably singles out, says here, Cephas or Peter. And then you go back into Matthew, and it talks about that a little bit. And it talks about, it probably singles out Peter because Peter probably had a very, very strong following or a very, very strong base group of people in Corinth. And it says it was custom for the church at that time to cover the expenses of these people coming in and out whenever they were ministering and when they were teaching and whenever they were setting up these places and helping these places grow. It was custom for those churches to cover the expenses of the wives as well. And it says here that a lot of people that have been in the Bible for a long time are really surprised to know that Peter was actually married. Y'all thought about that? Anybody ever thought about that? Peter, as big an influence as he was in spreading the gospel and working toward spreading the gospel, that he had a wife. I'm just saying that because it doesn't mention much about her, does it? Where's one of the only places that it even mentions anything about her is where? Huh? It talks about it here in, let's see, Matthew 8:14. If you go back to Matthew 8:14, somebody go back and read Matthew 8:14. That's not one that asks you to write anything down on, but I'm just asking you to go back and somebody look it up and read it real quick. So Peter was married, correct? Because he went to his house and he saw his wife's mother laying sick with a fever. So I guess my question here in this part is that, we hear an awful lot about Peter and about the ministry and about the disciples and about what they did throughout all of their teaching and setting up churches and preaching the gospel and the people coming to know the Lord, but we don't really think about this woman that was in the back here, kind of sitting back here, not being mentioned. What was she doing? How was she being supported? How was she being taken care of during this time? And it's talking about here that it was custom for the churches to take care of these people and to cover those needs during that time. So it says, Paul here, he asks, or I only and Barnabas have not we power to forbear working? And of course, everybody knows who Barnabas was. He was Paul's kind of associate or partner on his first missionary journey. And it says, though Paul had every right to expect the church to provide for him financially, did he do that? Did he? No, he did not. And that was a lot of people's question, is that if you are who you say you are, and if you are called by God to do what God says, what you say God's called you to do, then why aren't you taking any support like everybody else is taking support or taking finances from it? That was what they were questioning. That was the whole preface of this conversation, as to why, if it's okay for everybody else and a man of God is doing this, then Paul, why aren't you doing it? And but it says here that Paul and Barnabas chose to work to support themselves so they would not be a burden to their new converts. And it says that Paul was what by trade? Anybody remember? Tent maker. So when you think about looking at Paul's ministry and what he did and everything, the travels and everything else, do we think about Paul building tents while he's doing that? No, I wouldn't even think he had time to do that with all of his preaching and teaching and traveling and everything else. But the Bible tells us that in Acts 18:3 that he used his trade to support his ministry, him and Barnabas both. And it says, however, some Christian believers apparently thought that since Paul didn't accept support from the churches, he wasn't equal to the other apostles. That was the question. That was the whole deal of this whole conversation, was that they didn't think that he had as much authority. They didn't think that he had as much right to be standing and teaching and telling them and leading them, because he didn't have as much authority because he didn't accept funding from those organizations. He worked and supported himself. And it says in verse 7 there that Paul makes a statement there that soldiers and farmers and shepherds and all those people that were supported by their work. And the principle is that pastors, church staff, and missionaries have the right to make a living as well on their own, apart from their work. Do you think that Preacher Doug comes and preaches and does and goes home and don't do anything else at all other than right here at this church? How many of y'all have ever called Doug during the week with a heat pump problem? I'll go with you because I'm a preacher. I can't come give you a hand. I can't come help you. No, he never. That's what it's talking about here, is that it's okay. The principle of this whole talk on this point is that it's okay for people in ministry positions to force this. Paul writes that the law teaches the same thing. In 9:8, he says, he quotes Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, what does it say in Deuteronomy 25:4? You may have that. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treads out the corn. What does that mean? What does it mean not to muzzle the ox when he treads out corn? Does that mean you're supposed to muzzle his mouth while he's plowing and treading it out so that he can't bend down and eat a grain of it while he's working? No, it's saying that the principle is that we're supposed to let those animals eat, let them take care of themselves. Even though they're working for us and providing for us, we're not supposed to keep them from eating what they're working at. And it talks about the grain and threshing out grain in the old times. The law demanded that they allow to eat some of the grain that they threshed. In verses 9 through 10, Paul says that this law was not given just to protect the animals or the oxen, but to establish a principle. And part of that principle is that ministering or mistreating animals is a sin, but do you not think it's a much greater sin to mistreat servants of God? So that's the principle of what he's talking about. God expects animals to be treated properly and taken care of. And it says then certainly that is even truer of the ministers that are working for him as well. So Paul writes here, if we have sown unto your spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So what's he saying there? If we have sown unto your spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? What's he saying? Y'all ain't talkative at all this morning. I'm on page 65, up at the top of the first paragraph there. Have I lost you that bad this morning? So basically, when most of the time when you see the word carnal in the Bible, you think what? Ooh, that's bad. Everybody's been trained to, conditioned to think, ooh, carnal. We stay away from carnal. Carnal's bad. Well, carnal doesn't always mean bad things. Carnal here is just meaning a worldly form of payment is all it's talking about. It's not saying that the carnal a lot of times when you talk about the carnal things of life, we're talking about carnal sin and stuff that we should stay away from and stuff that we shouldn't be involved in. That's not what it's talking about here in this passage. It's talking about carnal payment or worldly monetary form of payment. So don't think of that as being, a bad thing. It says, when a church fails to pay his pastor a fair financial package, God will move that person to that he left from the pastor they deserve. So is it going to benefit a church not to fairly pay its pastor or its people that are working? No. Because it specifically says, Paul says, basically there that if you're not paying God, then he's probably going to be led to go. So that's something that we should all be aware of if we're leaders in church, or if we're somebody that's sitting in these positions. When you hear people say, well, that's just too much money, or well, that's just, we need to really be thinking about, okay, what's the average of our body, what's the average of our church body probably making on average, and what would be a fair wage to say, okay, we want this man of God to be taken care of. You don't look and say, oh, well, the most poverty people in America are making X amount of dollars, so we're going to pay our pastor that. You want to pay him on average of what is at least on average or above what everybody else is making. Take care of him and show him that you love him, show him that you support him, and that we're going to take care of him. And that's what I think is being said here. Even though Paul can rightfully be a partaker of support from the churches, he chooses not to do that. And Paul chooses not to do it because he's afraid it might hinder the gospel. And he says he doesn't want a prospective convert to look at him and think that he's doing what he's doing just because he's doing it for the money. That's why Paul did what he did. It says in verse 13, Paul reminds his readers that priests who served in the tabernacle and later in the temple were supported by receiving portions of the crops and animals brought in for offerings to the Lord. That's in Numbers. If you want to go back in Numbers and you want to look and see, Dad has done a real good job on going through the first parts of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all that coming up through the study through the Bible. But if you want to go back and you want to look at tabernacle practices and at what they did and how they supported and all that stuff, they were supported of the stuff brought in, weren't they, Dad? They weren't supported by any other means other than the ministry that they were doing. So you look at that. Paul writes here in 14, preach the gospel should. If you're called to preach it, then you need to be supported and live by it, and that's what he's saying. You got anything to add to that? But the Levites were the ones in the cities that were set up to take care of the temples and the tabernacles and right. Synagogue. They were supported by those places. So anyway, that's why Paul's trying to establish the fact here that, it's okay, but it's okay if somebody chooses not to and they want to use their original profession to be supported while they're ministering. It's okay if they want to do that. Paul chose not to because he didn't want for one second anybody to look at him and say, he's a Joel Osteen. And the only reason he's doing it is because he's getting rich and he's got money. He wouldn't be preaching if it wasn't for the money. And that's what Paul did not, Yep. Sure. And that's why I told Kyle, I said, yeah, I love to fish, and we fish a lot together. But if I had to fish for a living, I look at these, honestly, I'm being serious. I look at these guys that are doing it on a level that they're fishing somewhere 40 some weeks out of the year, 5 to 6 days a week, and they're practicing, they're staying, they're constantly gone from their families, they're constantly. That would take the joy out of that for me. So if I wasn't getting paid doing that, then I wouldn't continue doing it, because, man, that would be, when you do something as a job, a lot of time it does take the joy out of doing it. You have to really love doing something to do it without pay. And Paul was to the point in his life and in his ministry that Paul knew that he was 100% called from an audible voice of God on the road to Damascus. He knew that that was his calling. He knew that that was what he had to do, and he knew that that's what he was going to do. So he knew that God was going to provide and that God was going to take care of him. So he did it because he loved it. He did it because he loved God. Now, submit the authority of the Bible. Support your pastor and staff. The last thing that we're going to talk about this morning is supply bridges, not fences. And it talks about here the voluntary forfeit of his rights to receive support that Paul had chosen. He says here that in 9:15, for it were better for me to die than that any man should make my glorying void. And that's what you just said, Tara. That Paul is sitting here saying that I would rather die than I would rather go on doing what I'm doing and lose the joy in why I'm doing it and what I'm doing it for. That's what he's saying. If I'm doing this and I'm not doing it out of love and joy, I'd rather be dead. And that's Paul's whole life. He was doing this because he knew that God called him, and every day, get up, that's my mission, is every day. God's called me to do this and to bring people to Christ. So he says that, then he would rather die than to lose the joy of preaching without monetary compensation. So when you get to the point in something where you can't do it, or you lose the joy in doing it because you're not getting monetary compensation, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. Now, I'm not talking about your job. I'm not talking about that you should go to work in the morning and say, I love this job so much that I don't want my paycheck this week. That's not what we're talking about. Because I don't think any of us in here on our regular job that we have to do, that we have to support our families with, should ever say that we love it so much that we're just not going to take pay for it. That's kind of ridiculous, because I'd walk out the door in like 32 seconds if they told me that. But when we come in this house and we come in here, if it meant that I'm going to lose the joy of coming in here and teaching on Sunday morning unless I expected you all to pay me, then I'd quit, because that's not what it's about, and that's not what God's called us to do. So that's where he's coming from. That's what he's saying. Paul explains that preaching the gospel isn't something he can boast about, because for necessity or obligation, he has to do it. And then in the last part of that verse, he says something, and it says, what does he say in the last part of 9:16, the very last part of 9:16, 1 Corinthians? Woe unto me if I what? Why does he say, woe unto me if I preach not the gospel? It's what he knew God had 100% God had called him to do. And he says, the word here, woe, it's an exclamation of grief or denunciation. And Paul basically is saying that it would bring very deep grief to the Lord if he did not preach the gospel, because that's what God had specifically called him to do. That would be like God saying, Frank, I want you to do this specifically. Frank, I want you to do this specifically. And you said, I ain't doing it. And you walk away. Woe unto me, because I'm walking away from what God has specifically asked me and called me to do. And that's where Paul is saying. To Paul preach the gospel was a solemn dispensation the Lord committed to him. He had a solemn dispensation, means that he had came down, he had looked at Paul, and he said, I choose you. I want you. I'm commanding you. This is what I want you to do. But he explains that his reward is the opportunity to preach without charge. That's what Paul, he's looking at it as an opportunity. He doesn't want to abuse his power, and he doesn't want to request money from the churches. He wants to do it because it is his calling. So, and Paul's trying to explain to them his motivation, why he does what he does. And he's trying to explain to them that they need not question his motives on why he doesn't take money or why he's doing it for this reason. He's trying to make them see that this ain't about me. And the moment that this becomes about me is the moment that it becomes ineffective. And that's where he is with this. He's explaining, though he's a free from all people, he's made himself a servant unto all, that he might gain the more, 9:19. And it says, to the Jews, and a lot of people would look at this, and they would think, wow, how hypocritical. But it's not. Because it says here, to the Jews, he becomes a Jew, obeying their dietary laws, that he might gain them that are under the law. When with the Gentiles, he doesn't obey Jewish law, meaning he eats the foods the Jews consider unclean or not kosher to gain them that are without the law. To the weak, which probably means the intellectually weak who have difficulty understanding the gospel, he explains at their level of understanding. Now, a lot of people would look at that and say, well, that's being hypocritical. Paul did what he had to do around the people he was around to reach them. If that meant, well, you know what it says about offending thy brother? That if you do something that offends your brother, then we're not supposed to do it, are we? Well, that's what life Paul lived. When he was around the Jews, he tried to walk their walk so he didn't offend them, because if he offended them, what good would he be on reaching them for Christ? When he was with the Gentiles, he did what he had to do not to offend them or not to make them look like he was looking down his nose at them, because if he did that, would they be receptive to his teaching? No, not in any way. So Paul did what he had to do to reach the groups that he was in front of when he was there. And that's what's called being a bridge builder. It means that you make a way for whoever you're talking to relate to that person and to respect that person and to try to reach them with the gospel. And it says Paul was always finding common ground. He was always finding common ground with unbelievers. Now, does that mean that he was going to believers that live different than him and ways of law and ritual and everything else? It leaves open a lot of discussion for question with people on hypocrisy and on, well, if I've heard people say, well, if I'm not going to do it in front of them, I'm not going to do it in front of anybody. Or if I'm going to do, it leaves a lot of room for people to be judgmental, doesn't it? Well, I'm trying to make sure, but I'm trying to make sure I explain it well enough to where people understand why Paul was doing what Paul was doing, and he wasn't trying to be judged. He wasn't trying to be looked at as a hypocrite. Paul was trying to put himself in a situation to reach certain scopes of people. I don't know that there's any way else to kind of explain that other than to just say that he wasn't being hypocritical. He was being an opportunist to where he did what he had to do to reach the group that was in front of him. It says here, and it gives an analogy here that in today's time that Paul might have rode a Harley or maybe wore a cowboy hat and boots. If he would help spread the gospel, he would eat grits and boiled okra with a smile. It says that why? And the whole reason in the last part of that verse is so they may what? So that they may be saved. And Paul didn't care what it took to do that. Paul didn't care what he had to do to reach those people. His whole goal was to do what he did so that they may be saved. They may hear the gospel and they may become believers. That's what his 100% goal was. It says, one man put it this way about a person who won him to Christ. He said, he built a bridge from my heart to his, and Jesus walked across it. Paul built bridges for the gospel's sake so that he could be a partaker of its blessings. He may have changed his message. We should never, ever, ever change the message, because the message is Jesus loves you. He died for you. He gave his life on the cross of Calvary. He rose on the third day. He lives today at the right hand of the Father, and he has a gift that he's offering if we'll just accept it. That should be the message. And Paul compares it to running a race. We know that he does that in several places in the New Testament. Talks about athletes being temperate in all things concerning their training. They do it to win a corruptible crown, but we are doing it to win an incorruptible. All disciplined Christians who forfeit their social rights to build up or win others are winners and will receive an imperishable crown or reward. Paul didn't run the race uncertainly. He didn't veer off. He didn't change the course. He didn't ever move. He never moved the goalpost. He was always running the race for the same purpose, the same goal ahead. And it says here, but I keep in 9:26, it says, or 9:27, Paul writes, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. Which means the word castaway, unfit, or rejected for use. Paul didn't want to do anything in his life to be unfit for use or rejected. And it says here, many gifted believers today are disqualified because of their lack of discipline. Some believers today have disqualified themselves to be useful in a lot of areas because of their decisions they've made. Now, does that mean that they're not useful? No, it doesn't mean they're not useful, but it means to a certain demographic of people, they might have lost their ability to reach them because of some decisions they've made in things that they've done in life. That doesn't mean they can't be used somewhere else, but it means that we can make decisions in our lives as Christians that will harm us on being able to be used in every demographic of the Christian walk. Does that make sense? So our actions as Christians are very important. Our actions as Christians are crucial as far as how we live our life and how we are able to spread the gospel. Our discipline and the sin we allow in our lives will affect us on how effective we are at being able to spread the gospel. And that's what it's saying here. We don't want to be a castaway or unfit or rejected for use. That's why we should set aside every weight and the sin that hinders us. In Hebrews 12:1 says, "Let us run the race with what? Patience that is set before us." To win our Christian life, those three principles have to be something that we look at every day. Submit to the authority of God's Word, support our pastor and our staff financially, and supply bridges and not fences. Have you ever set up a fence in somebody's life that you didn't really mean to put there, but you did? I have. It was unintentional, but it was out of ignorance, and it was out of not seeking God's face in decisions. But we're supposed to be setting up bridges and not fences. So really think and pray about things when we do them, because we don't want to be that person that's setting up fences instead of bridges. Anybody have any questions? Y'all are about as quiet this morning as I've seen you in a while. Kevin, will you dismiss?